Hello everyone, we are back for our last part of the scientific method. So we've already talked about identifying a problem, coming up with a research question, doing some background research and getting some background information, creating the hypothesis, doing the experiment, and while we're doing the experiment, making our observations. And now we have to talk about our conclusions and communicating our results, communicating our data. So when we talk about our conclusions and our communicating of our results, what we're trying to do is answer this question. What did you find the answer to the question was? So one of the first steps of the scientific method is to come up with a research question, right? So at the end, this is your reflection piece, your conclusion. Did you answer your research question? All right. So that's why we need to make sure that our research question is specific, because when we finish our experiment, when we finish our test, we are going to think back to the beginning. Did we answer our question? Right. Now we're going to talk about the hypothesis and how that relates to our conclusion. So we make our if-then statement, right? We make our hypothesis. And now that we've finished all of our testing and our experimenting, we need to figure out, was our hypothesis accepted or rejected? And if you accept your hypothesis, right, you accept your hypothesis when your hypothesis was correct, when it was right. Your if-then statement matches your results. You reject your hypothesis if you were wrong, right? And guess what? In science, it's okay to be wrong. So one of the second pieces of writing our conclusion and drawing conclusions is we talk about our hypothesis and whether we accept it or reject it. Were we right or were we wrong? Right? And the last part here, why do you think what happened happened? So you did your experiment and you saw some things. Maybe they were cool, maybe they were unexpected. So this is your chance to tell the world what you found, right? What was interesting, what was weird? What did you observe that was not what you were expecting? Maybe your observations were exactly what you were expecting. So you'd want to write that down too. So this is the meat and potatoes of your paper. All right, so when we write a lab report, our biggest section is typically our conclusion and communicating our results. This is where we talk about, I wish I did this differently. I wonder what would happen if we did it like this next time. Something went wrong. Something went right. So the conclusion and communicating results section, that is where you are really telling the world everything that you observed, everything that you think might have impacted the experiment. This is where you're just telling us everything you can think of about the experiment. What went right, what went wrong, what you wish you did differently, what you did that worked amazingly, all of that. All right. So now we have finished talking about the scientific method. Last week, we talked about all of the vocabulary words that we needed. So we learned about hypotheses, we learned about variables, we learned about predictions, we learned about quantitative and qualitative observations. And this week, these past couple of days, we worked on tying it together. So we learned all of these words, but what the heck do they have to do with the scientific method? Right? So here it is. Here it is in a nutshell, right? So here it is, our 6 steps. So number 1, we ask questions, right? So we identify a problem, and then we come up with a specific question. And I believe we all did the exercise where we practice thinking of problems in the world, in our community, and coming up with specific questions that one could research. Right? We talked about how you research and where you can go to find information. Right now, probably the most convenient way, because we're at home on computers, is just to type something into Google or Microsoft Edge and ask them a question. Then we talked about our hypothesis. And this week we really went a little bit deeper. We really elaborated on what a hypothesis is and the different parts, right? So we know that a hypothesis always has to have the words if and then. And this week we also learned that the first part of our hypothesis, the if, that talks about our independent variable. The independent variable, what we're changing. So think about it, if we change this. And the second part of our hypothesis, the then part of the hypothesis, we talk about the dependent variable. Right? So then this will happen. Then this will be the outcome. So if we put it together, we can think about it this way. If we change something, then this will happen. So that is how we figured out that the independent variable is identified in the first half of our hypothesis, and the second half of our hypothesis, we make an educated prediction based on research of what we think the outcome is, of what we think our dependent variable is going to look like. And then we talked about the experiment. Right? So we spent quite a bit of time talking about the experiment and how experiment is such a broad word to say when it really breaks down into 2 key parts. Right? So the 2 parts of the experiment are the materials and procedure. So you need to know what you need to know what stuff you need to get, and then once you get the stuff, you need to know what to do with it. So those are the basic parts of an experiment. You need to have your ingredients list, your materials, and then you need to know what to do with it, right? You need to know what to do with it. So that would be more of like our recipe. Then we talked about making observations and collecting data, so analyzing our data. Right? And data is just a fancy word for observations. And they can be qualitative, so more visual observations, more sensory observations, or they can be quantitative, observations that include numbers. So it could be weight, it could be age, it could be length, right? It can be lots of different things that involve numbers and counting. So that is quantitative. And we also learned yesterday that there's different types of ways we can visually display that data. So we also learned that there's many different ways to collect data, and depending on what type of observation you make depends on which way is best suited for you. So if you're making a qualitative observation, drawing a picture would probably be the best way to go, or writing down descriptive words. If you're making quantitative observations, doing a tally or making a graph, a pie chart, those would be tools for you to use. And then we get to our last step here, communicating our results, drawing conclusions. And that is shown on this slide in the picture with the check mark and the X, right? So we're talking about, are we accepting our hypothesis? Did our results match our hypothesis, right? Did our results match what we thought was going to happen? Or are we rejecting our hypothesis? Was our hypothesis not quite what we saw in our results, right? Were they different? And it's okay if they were different, right? Scientists get things wrong all the time. That's why the scientific method, you can start and end and go back and try all over again.